everybody. My name is Dr. John Maida. I'm a professor in the political science department here at UNG. We've got a lot of great faculty here to help discuss a little bit this issue that's very important and in the news right now. We've got Dr. Craig Greathouse, who is the department head for political science and international affairs, Dr. Sam Rohrer, who's also a professor in political science and international affairs. We have lots of other faculty here as well. Dr. Stephen Northam, Dr. Mike Prue from history, Dr. Vicki Hightower from history. Who else am I missing? Dr. Beeman Miller from political science and international affairs. We've kind of fielded a lot of questions about this issue this week, and we thought it would be great to do something kind of informal and very quick in order to get a little bit of information out there to help you understand some of the complexity behind this. But we're going to mostly leave it up to questions that you guys might have, because we know that there's just an awful lot of different ideas and questions that you have. So I first want to say that this is a very kind of important and very serious and very passionate issue. So we would like to stress that all of our interaction today should be polite, it should be professional, and it should be on an academic basis. We're not going to be here today to tell you about how to deal with human rights issues or what side is right or wrong. What we'd like to do is kind of explain a little bit about why this is such a big global issue and why it has been a problem for so long. And the three of us are each going to talk a little bit differently to show you a different perspective or reason as to why this might be the big conflict it is. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how countries have formed in this part of the world. Dr. Rohrer is going to talk a little bit more about Hamas and the 1967 borders and kind of the non-governmental organizational part of this conflict. And Dr. Greathouse is a security studies scholar, and he's going to talk a little bit about the global implications of security and why this issue is so important for many countries around the world. And we have history faculty that Dr. Hightower is a scholar in history and Middle Eastern history, and she's happy to answer questions that you might have that are more historically focused. So just really quick, from my perspective, if we look at the map as it is today, these are the countries as we see them today. Here's Israel, here's the West Bank and Gaza. You guys probably recognize a lot of these other countries. In my global issues class, a bunch of you are here. I've constantly talked about how the borders for these parts of the world are not very old, and they've changed dramatically over time. If we go just back 115 years, none of the countries that are on the first slide exist. It's all part of the Ottoman Empire. So while you think that the countries that we have on the map today have been there for a long time, that's just not the case. In addition, once the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, the Europeans tried to carve up the whole region for themselves. And so there was an agreement in 1916 to divide up what is now Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel, parts of Turkey, and Iraq among the French and the British. And they were the ones that created the borders that we have today. So, these countries were not created by the people that live there. And therefore, they're not necessarily happy about the borders as they are. After World War II, the United Nations tried to settle the issue between the Palestinians and the Israelis in this area by proposing a plan for two separate countries in basically the same area. And the gray or the tan is Palestinian and the blue is Israeli, but neither side was really happy about that, and there was almost immediately a war. So the conflict that's going on today is one of many, many conflicts between the two sides. over the borders and who gets control over the land. So the point I want to make is that the borders of the countries that we see today were made by the Europeans and not by the Israelis or the Palestinians. And neither side is happy, and they've been kind of fighting with each other to try and reorganize the area along their own interests ever since. And history is a big part of this problem, as well as governance of the modern countries that exist. And we can talk about that later with questions. Dr. Rohrer, do you want to say a few words?
I think John gives a nice historical overview. What I thought seemed useful is, since we're talking about Gaza, you go, how does Israel end up with this? As a result of the Six-Day War, which I'm not going to talk a lot about, but I think part of the issue we have when we look at Israel from an American perspective is sort of how Israel behaves. I think from an American point of view, people tend to look at Israel as a state which appears very European and familiar and comfortable, and we look at this as a state which seems like it's reacted from a defensive position and has negotiated back land in terms for achieving more of a peaceful status. But there's also been a lot of changes in terms of Israeli attitudes. Right, as you move into the 80s, you have more of an increase in right-leaning religious parties that can win elections because they made deals with appealed more to Sephardic Jews. So Israel goes from being kind of center-left to a little more wibbly-wobbly. And then when you get to this century, a lot of Israeli positions and attitudes towards things like defense and the use of force have been really strongly influenced by the migration of about 1 million Russians following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they fundamentally have reshaped domestic attitudes in Israel. You see more nationalistic attitudes being more common. You see things like should force be used being more accepted as a position. So there is actually a lot of change that's occurred in terms of domestic attitudes. And just looking at Israel as sort of one static thing from this point forward is kind of short-sighted. When you talk about Hamas, it's an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was set up to be a counterpoint to a previous group that was called Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And what you have now is this sort of divide where you have a Palestinian Authority over here, some elements of Hamas, but largely Hamas is running Gaza. While they both claim to represent the interest of the Palestinians, they're acting pretty divergently right now, and perhaps not really as a...
Have been for a long time.
Yeah, not really as a unified entity. So when you look at what's going on now, the debate is this sort of a poorly executed pseudo-state trying to wage a war is going to lose, or what are the strategic objectives of this are an act of terrorism, right? What's the reaction they're trying to get? What are the objectives they're trying to get?
Okay. And Dr. Greathouse will just talk a little bit about why this is important from a security perspective internationally.
So when you start to look at the international security aspects of it, you've got some very brutal things going on right now, and if Israel launches a ground war into Gaza, it's going to get really ugly, all right? Because there is not going to be a good outcome. But it's about, is this the match that sets off the powder keg in terms of a domino effect, in terms of conflict? You've already seen some attacks coming in from the West Bank and from southern Lebanon into Israel, and Israel's responded a little bit. However, do those two areas become more involved?
There's Syria as well.
There's Syria, which basically has elements, the government of Syria has elements which are supported by Iran, and of course they don't like Israel to start with. Russia, Iran, okay? So there's a lot of players that can become very heavily involved in this. If you all of a sudden start to threaten in one of the primary sources of the world's oil, if I've got a war going across the entire Middle East, that can become an issue. Does that bring in other outside players? Does the US have to come back in? Do Britain and France have to come back in? Does Russia start having to deploy more forces in? How active do the Iranians get? How much does that juice up what's going on in Syria and what is happening in Iraq? in what's happening in Saudi Arabia and Yemen and every place else. So this becomes the issue, is you have this issue, which is bad. Is it basically the fuse to set off everything else?
Can it bring in Russia, Iran, the United States, other countries?
Right.
I spent a decade talking about the Arab Spring in Middle Eastern politics classes, and there was virtually no improvement in democracy in the Middle East. And most of these countries have the same authoritarian governments they had prior to this wave of revolution that happened from Morocco all the way to Iraq and Israel. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was frozen during all this time. And this is kind of it coming out of its slumber. And as you're saying, it has the risk of having a war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, Israel and Syria, and Israel and Hezbollah, which is a group that has a lot of power in Lebanon. They've fought separate wars with all these countries, and there's a lot of concern that it could have a three-front war that would cause a lot of global ramifications, including oil, security, and possible conflict between the US and Iran or Russia.
Basically, Iran has already come out and said they will attack if the U.S. gets involved directly to support Israel.
So the more we talked about kind of setting this up, the more complicated any explanation got. So what we wanted to do was just give you guys a little introduction. I think we're finished with that. If you have questions, please let me know, and we can kind of start with there. Do you have anything you want to add, Dr. Hightower, before we...
Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas went to Russia today to talk to Putin.
Did he? Okay, so that's an example of the Palestinian Authority leader who governs this area asking Russia, or meeting Russia and potentially asking for help. Right?
I was in a call this morning with some of my colleagues in Israel, and they're expecting the ground force, they're expecting the invasion of Gaza, and they're working with the UN and Egypt to try and create a humanitarian corridor to get those civilians out of Gaza.
And I think that's the thing that everybody sees is all the humanitarian tragedies and violations on all sides. And this has been that list I had of dozens of conflicts between the parties. The big losers are the people that live in the area. And so the humanitarian violations on all sides are really what makes this so tragic. And that's why kind of talking about what made it a problem is helpful, at least in understanding why it's an issue, if not making it even more complicated to try and solve.
Okay, so we'll open it up for
Questions?
questions.
Dom, do you have a question?
Yeah. So
Would you mind just standing up so that people can hear you?
So like the sentiments that we see from both nations and social media, could you like explain the Oslo Accords and why like a two-state like solution's not working?
Why it's not working?
And why did Oslo Accords fail?
Well, so, you know, after World War II, the United Nations tried to negotiate a two-state settlement because once Israel was created with the help of the British in the early 20th century, the Jews were in the area, and, you know, it seemed like the best situation was to create two states that kind of live side by side, but they divide up the land in some way. The reason that all of these attempts to settle the conflict failed probably goes along with what you were saying about kind of extremist individuals on both sides of the negotiation doing what they can to kind of sabotage any peace agreement. And therefore it kind of collapses as it's getting close to, you know, really being implemented, yeah.
The longer it goes on, the harder it is to be viable. When you see the rise of right-leaning parties in the 80s, there's an increase in settlement growth. So they're intentionally building, you know, Israeli suburbs in the West Bank with the goal of making it harder to separate it. When we talk about the 1967 boundary, another debate is if Israel has to withdraw from it, how much should it withdraw from? Right? UN Security Council Resolution 242 says Israel needs to withdraw from territory. It doesn't say all territory, and it intentionally doesn't say all territory. So while that line gets talked about a lot, you know, there's something to say the Israelis don't have to pull out of all of it. And so you have some debate where Palestinian groups say the border has to be the 1967 line, and you have elements in Israel that go, well, no, the UN said we don't have to withdraw from all of it. They've increasingly made it hard. Some of the other failures.
Yeah, I mean, the longer that this goes on, the more land is kind of taken by Israel.
Yeah. Some of the other failures.
It's harder to reverse it all and put it back to where it might have been in 1948.
Like where you're going, why haven't they tried to negotiate a two-state solution? In 2000 they tried, but they disagreed on what they agreed to. Right? The Israelis went, see, we're just going to annex where we've had a lot of settlement growth, but the way it was perceived by the Palestinians as a component of that is the Israelis retained the right to move security forces to the Jordan River along what they argued were going to be predefined routes. So from the Israeli point of view, they argued they were trying to be restrained. From the Palestinian point of view, they go, if you're maintaining the security presence, you're really not giving us all of that. That was a breakdown point there.
1967 is kind of the year that the borders would go back to if there was going to be a settlement.
And this really moves you towards things like the security barrier. The Israelis then argue they tried to have a good faith partner and failed. So they would argue the construction of the wall is effectively a unilateral partition, where they go, well, in the brown part, we're trying to wall in what we argue is settlement territory, or where we settled. Where you get in trouble is where they add the other side, which, you know, was supposed to protect security issues and water access, but when you throw them both in, then you really start cutting things up into a hodgepodge. So the failure to make an earlier agreement is what gets you to where you're at now. The stronger side just sort of acted on.
You also mentioned the pullout from Gaza there. A failed partnership when Israel withdrew all its forces and settlers from the Gaza Strip in 2004 and 2005. They had an election in 2006, and Hamas won the election. And they're kind of recognized by most countries of the world as a terrorist organization. And so, you know, they have been working with Hezbollah and with Iran and inhibiting the Palestinian Authority from running the country as well. So now you have two different Palestinian groups that can't agree on what they want. And you know, it just makes settlement much more difficult.
Okay. Another question. Yes, sir, back there.
What's Hamas's goals for these attacks?
We're not sure yet. If you look at some of the military, and I'll look at the military, the attacks are more than terrorism, but they don't fit the elements of terrorism. You don't see certain demands, you don't see anything. You're seeing a lot of damage being caused, right? So from the strategic military side, it's not clear what they want, okay? Political side, and I'll let, you know.
Well, I think that over the last couple of years, the number of Palestinians that have been killed by Israeli security forces in the West Bank has been quite high. And so, at least to some degree, I've been reading that it's a, you know, kind of revenge for the treatment of Palestinians by the Israeli security forces. So,
You know, as we talk about something that's dynamic and uncertain, right? What can possibly go wrong as we talk about this? When you go, what are other potential explanations? Well, one you can look at it as a pseudo-state conflict. If you think of Gaza as having a government that engages in diplomacy and Hamas defined territory, population, then this looks like a really poorly planned out war. Another argument would go, if you're Hamas, you look at Israel as seeming increasingly entrenched, increasingly less interested in a two-state solution. So you just might look at it as your back is against the wall and you have to act in some way, because they would argue they don't have a good faith partner. Another argument that's come up is this might be a power play, because if you were going to look at the Palestinian Authority, it wasn't able to slow down states in the Persian Gulf from starting to normalize relations with Israel. And if this is loosely based on terrorism. Gaza is a trap for Israel. You lash out violently, you expect the Israelis to respond with overwhelming force, probably do something wrong somewhere along the way, which creates bad PR, get them bogged down, maybe that slows down something like the Abraham Accord, and then maybe you make a pitch that, see, we did what Fatah couldn't. We've strengthened, we reminded the Arab world that we exist, and we've slowed down things that Fatah couldn't. So that it could be a power play in a way.
Dr. Hightower, you said you spoke to some colleagues in Israel that they fully expected a full Israeli invasion into the Gaza Strip.
They expect the ground war to start in the next week or so. For Gaza, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a little bit early maybe to do this because it's pretty early on in what is developing.
But I think if you go back to the map that you had about on the 2 slides down from where you are,
Okay.
the map with the dots of
Yeah.
where Hamas is attacking, what they're doing, at least in the near, right, is expanding that territory, right? They're trying to take that territory and make Israel pull out. They've
Well, this morning I read that Israel had succeeded in
Oh,
closing
yeah,
the
no.
border.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, but the student asked, that's the goal. The goal
Oh,
was
yeah.
to expand territory, now they failed. Now what's their goal?
If you don't mind me asking, I heard Israel has a very advanced intelligence agency. How did they not predict such a large attack?
Let's go. That's going to be a major issue in Israel. They put huge amounts of resources, Mossad and military intelligence. When this is done, it's going to be a major, major issue. It's going to go back something to what happened in the '73 war, where Israel got surprised.
Or
and
the
they shouldn't-
United States after 9/11.
or the U.S. after 9/11.
It just was not,
They missed.
Yeah, the argument goes, you know, the U.S. missed 9/11 because there's always chatter from certain terrorist groups, and there's your low probability attack, your medium, and your really unlikely one. People are always talking about the really unlikely one, but trying to be able to actually spot it is a little tough. So this is probably just going to be an intelligence failure where some analysts went, there's always noise about Hamas doing something in Gaza, and it got kicked up, and somebody went, yeah, but that's what it all said last week too.
Right.
And it's probably just going to be a human error.
But at the
along
same
those
time, it's
lines.
going to have some ramifications in Israeli politics.
And when Vicki mentions their fleeting effort to hold territory, that's what makes it a little weird when you go, is this a failed sort of state trying to wage a state-based war and hold territory? Usually terrorists don't want to hold territory. It makes you easy to find. You want to attack and get out of the way and then come back later and be nice to people so they think you're the good guy. So that's kind of the plot twist. That and the number of hostages that are taken are both new, both different. And the most plausible, I think the argument that it just might be extremely violent bait to drag 300,000 mobilized soldiers into an urban warfare pit to try to get some sort of political advantage gets the closest to maybe making sense to me, which is opinion based.
So,
You have that, the slide about the population density in Gaza. I mean, taking over the Gaza Strip with 2.3 million people living in an area the size of, what did you say, Brooklyn?
It is just slightly smaller than Brooklyn and Queens combined with half the population.
Okay. So it's a
we-
very densely populated
Yeah.
urban
It's,
area.
it's like the population of Brooklyn, but if you spread it across both boroughs.
It'd be a very, very difficult military operation.
It's very.
Is there a question in here, in green?
Hey, so I was going to ask, I've heard and seen things about, people that claim the Israeli Prime Minister, Netanyahu, is somewhat more of an extreme case politically than some previous prime ministers. So I wanted to ask, how does he compare to previous administration, and does someone like that have the power to make some sort of unitary executive decision to start a ground war?
From what I know, all right, and this is not but in terms of military, he's been a little bit more restrained than certain ones in the past. But the fact that they created a unity government today, Basically, they brought their biggest elements together and they're putting everything else on hold until they deal with this. The fact that they called up 300,000 troops, yes, he has the power to push this. So,
Where does Netanyahu fall on the scale? He's pretty far to the right. He has no intention of leaving the West Bank. He wants to keep all of it or as much of it as he can. And when I talk about some of the changes in domestic Israeli politics, that's where you see the shift away from the idea of, oh, this poor state that's attacked but negotiates and is willing to cede land for peace. That from the 80s through the 2000s, you would kind of go back and forth. You get a centrist to a left-leaning Israeli government, and you would try to restart negotiations. Negotiations fail. Right-leaning government comes in, they resume settlement growth and try to make it even harder to pull that off. And when I talk about the demographic changes that have happened in Israel, is just political attitudes. When you talk about the Israeli election, Netanyahu re-wins his mandate by like that much in the past 2. It's just a squeaker. And there is an argument that a lot of this is really influenced by the demographic changes. There's a good book on that called The Million Who Changed the Middle East, where it's specifically focusing on the impact of post-Soviet immigration into Israel, where there's less restraint. Force is viewed as an appropriate solution to a lot of problems. There's less interest in settlement, where you see people make comments over the past 20 years once in a while. I moved from the largest country in the world to the smallest. Why would I give half of it away? There's some different attitudes that are brought in that really do play an impact in terms of being swing voters.
I would say lastly, in my global issues class, Max and other students have been following this new law that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to pass that will reduce the power of the Supreme Court to check the power of the legislative branch. And there have been protests for months and months of the Israeli population that sees that as a reduction of democracy and an increase in the power of the Prime Minister and of the executive branch. And I think that the big worry is that this war cabinet and an invasion of Gaza would further solidify the goals of those like-minded people in Israel.
we had a question? Yes. Go ahead.
Sorry, my brain said. Do you know who's funding the Hamas, like with their weapons? Where are they getting their weapons from?
A lot of the funding, from what I've seen in the literature that's published, that's followed from SIPRI and other organizations, is a lot of it's coming from unofficially from Iran, but there's also supplies from other countries and other elements throughout the Middle East. There's a lot of weapons floating around the Middle East. So moving them to, and it may not be a government supporting them, it could be individuals that are supporting. So if you look at Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden was basically, had financiers in Saudi Arabia, even though the US was a major ally of Saudi Arabia. So you've got a lot of sources of weapons in the area.
It's all unofficial.
Yeah. Nobody comes out and says it.
Well, there was a piece in the Times just before we came over where, of course, off the record, like the Al-Quds militia and goes, well, we didn't know they were going to do that. So even if they were providing support, the at least preliminary assessment is everyone's still kind of surprised Hamas did what they did.
Right.
Like at least two.
Ben?
So to go along with that question, I was wondering, because I've seen a lot of division on social media and stuff, who is most widely supported globally? Because it's really hard for me to tell.
Between Israel and Palestine?
Yeah.
Israel and Hamas or Israel and Palestine?
That's the thing, it's people are they support the victims, and then someone will say they support the victims of another country. So it's hard to tell what side they're
So
really on.
that's part of the reason why we wanted to have this, because Hamas is one part of the Palestinian representation.
And then people
It's
are
not a
just
country by itself.
Right, and they're free Palestine, but then it's
Yeah.
it's two different things within one country.
Yeah, it's all connected to the same conflict, which is
Right.
why we wanted to give you some sort of, I don't know how we answer that. So your question is basically who is more supported internationally, the Israelis or the Palestinians?
Yeah.
It would vary. Like even if you just
Yeah.
look at who extends recognition, a lot of the world accepts and recognizes Palestine as a state. The U.S. and Western Europe and our allies don't. So I mean, you probably see a breakdown of it pretty close to that, right? In the U.S., you won't even acknowledge it is a state, or maybe it's flirting with one too.
The conflict has gone on for
Yeah.
so long, and people have supported both sides for so long that there is, without really quantifying it, there's very robust support for both sides that's gone on for.
That's the worst part about this, is if you just look at it long term, you know, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, and they've both been terrible at different times.
Yes?
So, say Israel seizes the Gaza Strip from Hamas after the fighting has died down, what are they going to do with it? Are they going to give it back to Gaza under some reconstruction government?
Actually, first thing you'd have to do is completely rebuild it, given what we're seeing coming out of it. The fact that the Israeli defense minister said civilian buildings are now legitimate targets. Okay,
They also said our goal is to have it never recover.
there's that too. So that's going to be, you know, a lot's going to depend on how long it takes them to
But
take
still,
it.
they don't want to occupy it permanently.
Well, who knows what they're going to want.
I mean, you kind of, the weird thing is right now you're getting something that flirts with, you know, historical siege, right? You've got people inside the walls, you cut off the food and the water. I mean, there's nothing good's going to happen.
Right. So I can't tell you right now what it's going to look like, because that's going to be a political decision. And right now, they're not thinking like that, or at least they're not saying anything out loud.
Dr. Hightower, any ideas from Israel about what the ultimate goal is from your colleagues that you spoke to?
Not really, but they're
Are they concerned about
yeah.
occupation of the entire Gaza Strip?
Not occupation. The seizing and the holding of it.
Yeah.
But they're concerned about all the tunnels that are underneath, because that's something that we see in Gaza. Is a lot of tunnels and tunnels that go across the border into into Egypt for smuggling and things like that. As well as the tunnels that, you know, might still exist under the existing border fence, the parts that weren't destroyed by the bulldozers. And so what they were saying is that they're going to have to basically demolish it if they're going to take it.
Right.
And they're going to hopefully let the civilians leave.
Has everybody seen photos of out of Baku in Ukraine? Yeah. You're going to get, the build-up areas are going to look like that.
Not
Yes,
too
they do.
different than the massacre of people at the concert in southern Israel, or different kibbutzes where they just, Hamas militants just came in and killed everybody. I mean, none of this is
Vicky, Dr. Hightower's point about the tunnels is absolutely right. That's one of the arguments for this being a bait. Because if you go in, there's just so many ways that bad things could happen. But when you're going, if you just look at the statements that are coming out of Israel, you know, politicians and military leaders comparing this to the equivalent of being Russian pogrom, something they never thought they'd live to see. They talk about, you know, reducing sort of your restrictions on military personnel that are being sent in. So you're going to see much less restraint on who you're supposed to be shooting at. So, right, you're going to get a very visceral and violent emotional reaction, which could play very well into the idea that you're just trying to bog down a superior force in a suboptimal urban subterranean environment. And, you know, but their problem is when you close the Israeli access points to Gaza, that cuts off like 70% of the supply. So even if you can smuggle things in through Egypt, you're only going to have the place running at about 30 to 40%.
it makes hard life much worse. Yeah.
You gotta also take into account that Egypt isn't going to want 1 million refugees coming into their country. That will risk destabilizing their entire country, which already has so many problems. So if Egypt, in its own self-defense, closes the border, then Israel can say, oh, we have a humanitarian corridor. But if it goes to a brick wall, then people are screwed either way.
Is there, Egypt is having,
I think they had airstrikes.
They did, they were right on the second
the
one.
Egyptian economy is kind of in free fall at the moment. So you're right, they don't want 1.5 million people going across the only border that's ever really open, which is the one with Israel.
which has now been closed.
Yep, in the front.
I was wondering about, I heard that there were some American hostages taken in the Hamas attack, with some Americans already getting other foreigners. Do you think that's going to bring more people involved in the conflict?
So
Could you repeat that question, please?
All right, she was asking about American hostages and may that bring the U.S. into the conflict?
I mean,
US
there were, how many Americans have they confirmed killed? 14?
14 or something like that, and a
And
few
there may be
American hostages.
hostages as well, along with,
Right.
you know, people from all over the world. that
So
were
here's
caught
what we
up
know,
in this.
is backed by treaty, the U.S. is resupplying Israel. The first plane of weapons and reinforcements arrived today.
Yes.
Yesterday? Okay. And more is coming. So as soon as there's a new speaker, what you're going to see is a very large support bill for Israel in terms of...
They're voting today at 3 o'clock.
Right.
Did they vote? Does Scalise get the speaker? Okay, so we now have a Speaker of the House in the United States, so we can actually pass a bill if we
Right.
want to support.
So you'll probably see a bill of a fairly significant amount of American military support. The U.S. military is probably not going to go in. It's going to be a situation like Ukraine. We will support an ally, but we're not going to get involved there with troops on the ground. In terms of hostages,
Kind of makes the whole thing.
it's a very difficult thing. You don't know where they are. You've got tunnels to hide them. You've got civilian buildings. You're going to have to go building to building. The likelihood, truthfully, of hostages getting out alive is low at this point.
Well, that's why the U.S. has been talking to other partners to try and negotiate the release of the civilians, as you were saying, Dr. Hightower. That would definitely kind of reduce the tension, I think, a little bit. Yes.
It's the mystery of what you're going to do with the hostages. A day or so ago, they threatened to execute a hostage for every, soft target that was hit in Gaza, but so far that hasn't started. And even if that was policy, at the rate things are going to get shelled, it wouldn't last very long. Yeah, hostages for like 3 days.
Yep.
If a ground war were to break out like tomorrow, which side would the U.S. support?
If a ground
Israel?
war were to break out tomorrow, what side would the U.S. be on?
It's
The
supporting
U.S.
Israel.
the U.S. would not enter into a ground war to support.
But let's say like other alliances came in and the U.S. had an independent, which side would it be on?
Truthfully, nobody's going to come to save Hamas because they can't get there. The Egyptian army's not going to do it, right?
The U.S. isn't going to do that.
The U.S. isn't going to do it. Iran can't get there in terms of putting ground forces on. Okay, they could do some strikes, which then creates the powder keg starts to burn.
I think everybody recognizes how this could get out of control.
Right,
really
very quickly. But nobody can
Nobody
effectively
wants to.
get to Gaza Strip. Right now, the Israeli Navy is blockading it off. You're not shipping anything through Israel, and essentially the border with Egypt is closed,
Question?
except for the tunnels.
Do you think it's more likely that Israel will enact just a permanent siege of Gaza, or will it try to occupy it like it did with the Golan Heights? And then if it does that, is that going to spark another 6 days?
They're going to occupy if they go in. They're not going to sit there. They basically ramped up too much military force to sit there. They're going to take it if they go.
You think so?
Yeah.
The whole thing and occupy it?
Why wouldn't they just do
If-
a war of attrition?
Well, they're going to basically, there may not be much left when they finish.
That doesn't help negotiate anything.
That's true.
Will they permanently occupy it then? And
I don't know. I don't know what their outcome is, but if they go, it's going to be a mess.
Well, I mean, if you go back to, are we acting like a state that launched a bad war, or are we acting like a terrorist organization? If you were Hamas, you don't have to win. You just have to outlast, and then you can claim it's a victory when Israel eventually leaves, and then you go, oh my God. Just forget all the terrible things we did to start. Here's our aid program, here's some money, let's rebuild some schools. And it sounds bad, but a lot of terrorism is really violent marketing. I somebody look bad. And as long as they don't get you, you get to come back and try to portray yourself as the less disruptive force.
Is there any chance Israel will actually be able to permanently snuff out Hamas?
No,
Or if they do, another organization will appear.
because you're trying to kill ideas.
And that's the flaw.
Question in the back?
Is anybody worried about Hamas like sparking like inspiration for other groups to come and do this too? Is there anybody that is like with Hamas that could come in and help them?
Hezbollah right now, right?
Hezbollah.
In the 21st century, all of these organizations can talk with each other and learn techniques and be inspired and work together.
There's a disaggregation of terrorist organizations. In the 20th century, we tend to look at these things as being more monolithic and usually tied to a liberation movement of some sort, an anti-colonial movement. Now, a lot of these things are interrelated. You know, is ISIS a global thing with an office in West Africa? Probably not. It's a lot of reasonably disparate groups loosely collaborating.
And they don't really like each other very much. They all have, as you said, very different goals. So,
It's kind of like Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is not an organization, it's a franchise by region. You know, those are different actors. So you could see some groups say they support it, they could provide support online. A lot of modern terrorist efforts are spent into radicalizing and promoting messages online. And that for some groups, they say that's just as meaningful and just as important as actually being a fighter. So there's going to be some sort of information to this. So I think you would see support. It doesn't necessarily need to be equipment people, but you know that's going to be a narrative. And in about a week, somebody's going to go, "Oh my God, Hamas had no choice. The Israelis locked up Gaza like it's escaped from New York." It wasn't a good scenario to start out with, but there's going to start being counter narrative.
So are you guys familiar with the video that Hamas put out recently, this morning?
I'm not, no.
So there was a video that the leader put out saying that all people of the Muslim religion need to start acting violently, and on Friday the 13th specifically, everyone needs to start attacking people of the Jewish religion. Do you think we're going to see the effects of that in America?
That's a pretty familiar cry for, kind of, whether it's pan-Arab or pan-Christian or pan-Jewish, unification of all people on a civilizational level to attack other people of a civilizational different group than them. And very often that is a call that's not answered at anywhere near the level that it's meant to, and it's probably more marketing.
In the U.S., it might also depend on media coverage. The number of hate crimes and threats against Jewish groups has been up for the past 5 years. So it could even be something that would be pretty boilerplate. It could be somebody who is already going to act. But here's where we talk about terrorists being disaggregated. Let's say you were planning to do something violent or threatening towards the Jewish population anyway. You might have already been planning to do, but now you're going to do it and say it's right
inspired by,
tied to that. So you could, and because someone said it, if something happens on Friday, it'll get coverage. And it'll be linked to that.
Let's try and get people that haven't asked questions. Tim, and then there's some guys in the back.
Can you briefly explain Israel's Iron Dome defense system and why it was so overwhelmed during the Hamas?
The Iron Dome system?
Yeah.
Basically Iron Dome and most anti-ballistic missiles or anti-missile systems, they can only do so many targets, right? You've got debates, and Dr. Rohr and I talked this morning, the numbers are anywhere between 2,500 and 5,000 rockets were launched the first day, all right? You can only intercept some, so some we're going to get through.
Aren't they more advanced than in years past as well?
Yeah, but it's a question of targeting and how fast you can target and keep it up, because a lot of the radar systems can only track so many targets at one time.
High volume of dumb rockets overwhelm the system.
Yeah. So Iron Dome we know works if you've got a few rockets in the air. If you've got 100 flying at one time, it doesn't have the magazine size to basically deal with them all, and then being able to track and hit, because it may take a couple interceptors to take out a missile. So just basically the number of rockets that they launched just overwhelmed the ability. And that's not surprising.
There are a couple of questions in the back there.
So I asked you this Monday, and I asked is this going to be Israel's Vietnam? But judging from how Gaza has the population and density of the two boroughs, is this going to be more so like a Russian Chechnya, where it's going to have like Russian special forces crying on radio, or is it going to be more prolonged like Vietnam, where it was stretched across the 60s to about the mid-70s?
Well, but remember, part of what solved Chechnya is the Russians bought off part of the Chechens. Israel's not going to be able to buy off parts like that. So that changes the dynamic. So you can't get that type of ending.
What also helped the Russians when they were dealing with the Chechens is they really weren't geographically mobile. They tended to be concentrated. They didn't move around a lot, so the Russians just kind of shelled everyone into oblivion. You know, maybe you have a lack of mobility due to space, but, you know, this gets into tunnels, access points are invisible. You know, the Russians won because, right, the rebel forces didn't move very far, so they just shell a town until it was gone and you get them. That's not necessarily the case here, so. But you're focused on urban conflict.
Right. If you look at Grozny, it's the same thing. The photos after Grozny, basically the city didn't exist. Could Israel undertake that strategy?
I'd also say, Leo, that Israel has kind of been on a war footing for decades.
Yes.
So it's kind of a new category in and of itself.
Israel's very surprised by this. They've spent 30 years trying to be less dependent on the U.S. for their security so they could act more without our approval. You know, they make more of their munitions, more of their rockets. U.S. aid only constitutes about 1% of the budget, whereas if you were going to look at 1980, it would have been like 10%. So they are still dependent on us, and they'll still happily take things, but they're also much more of an independent actor than they've been in all of these previous conflicts.
There's a couple questions in the back behind you, Leo. Yeah.
Could Hamas's victory lead to greater consequences to if Israel were to win? Because you stated if Israel were to like snuff out the quote terrorist organization, another one would just pop out of nowhere, or not out of nowhere. But
So your question is, if Hamas were to win the conflict, would it
become greater, to, like globally?
Hamas, remember, but also when you start to talk about Hamas, you're also getting into Islamic religious motivations and other motivations. So at that point, you don't have monolithic Islam, right? So that also becomes an issue. So,
well, I think you're kind of asking if Hamas were to win this conflict, would it have bigger effects globally?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
but
I think it definitely would. Here, like if it disrupts normalization that, you know, Israel's been achieving in the Arab world, that would have a big impact. Right, if Hamas emerges as a leading organization over something like Fatah, that would have a big impact. But
it
you
used
know,
to
so
be.
there's a lot of potentially large impacts, and it could achieve those again, not through outright winning, but just not losing and still being there in the end. Because it would go, look, we slowed down diplomacy. Hamas couldn't do that, and you know the reason they're afraid to have an election is because you're all clearly going to think we're better because we can deliver more goods for you. So I mean, it could.
Was there another question in the back? Did you have a question? No? Okay, good.
So,
then Max? Yeah, go ahead.
So obviously there could be a couple different things that translate to this, but what might be possible tipping points that would bring in some major players on a global scale?
If you get Syria starting to move some stuff, you may get the Israelis striking in Syria. That doesn't bother them at all. I don't think Iran will push because they may, but I don't think they will. If somebody attacks the U.S. directly, say a U.S. warship or something like that, does the U.S. do some offshore strikes or something like that?
Would you compare this to possible Russian use of nuclear weapon in Ukraine, dragging the U.S. in I think that seems to be more
Yeah.
of a likely scenario than what's going on
Yeah.
at least at this point.
So, you know, I don't think you have a bigger powder keg in Ukraine, from my point of view, but can you get some real regional destabilization? Yeah, depending on how this goes.
And that's another reason you see a unity government in Israel. Netanyahu, no one's going to be super excited about doing outreach with him. But, you know, somebody like Benny Gantz or more of a centrist figure, if they can just convince some Arab states to not be opposed to it, but at least express neutral positions, that strengthens Israel being able to be active in Gaza for longer.
Max, question?
Oh, yes. Since I've read most of that Israel indirectly that's nuclear power, you know, it's nuclear power. So depending on how this is going to escalate, I don't know how bad this conflict's going to get worse. I don't know how it's going to get worse. But what do you think is going to? How do you think this whole conflict will escalate?
I mean, from a nuclear perspective.
They're not.
But
They're
Iran
not.
is developing
Right.
nuclear
They're-
weapons.
Right.
They're unofficially Israel is a nuclear power, so
This is one.
Right.
it has
So
that potential. I
you
suppose.
don't see Israel using it on Gaza. And, okay. Israel's got a limited number of weapons. Where they're going to target you is counter value probably, which means going after cities, capitals, and things like that.
They would likely have a lot of nuclear fallout inside their own country.
Right. So they're not going to use it in Gaza. But, you know, I don't see this escalating to a point where Israel's doing that, unless it's an existential threat. If Israel believes they're going down.
At this point, the Ukraine-Russia situation is much more dangerous from a nuclear perspective.
Yeah.
Is there anybody that?
We got one more question.
Yeah, he just had his hand up for a while.
Considering what we've said in the past, and just looking at the wars in the past in this area, do we think conflict is going to last within 2 weeks, a month, 6 months in terms of perspective and size, or do you think it's going to be more prolonged, maybe upwards of a year?
I think that goes with the shift when you look at the series of conflicts. When you look at the first series of wars, that's Israel being engaged in state-based conflict and having an effective military, always having a large military, and state on state, they do well. But the challenge now is when you start dealing with things that don't instill quite as easily, it's easier for pseudo-state or non-state actors to drag things out longer, which gets back to, maybe your goal is not to win, it's just to make the fight go on so long, you make the stronger force, which clearly.
Don't you think it's a trap, though?
I do. I think that's the only, the more I think about it, it's the only thing that feels like it makes sense. Hamas can't win a war with Israel. A lot of other Arab states are not going to come rushing in. No one, the entire trend towards normalization.
It doesn't
Not
seem like it's in their
escalation,
best
so it's a
interest
pace.
to try and take the entire Gaza Strip, because it would be very difficult to do. And if we got rid of Hamas, you'd have another organization, and
But it's probably not going to be a 2-week thing.
It's going to be long.
It's going to be longer. Yeah. All right. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. We've unfortunately reached our time. And
if you have questions you want to ask, come on up after, and we can address a couple.
And if you haven't signed in, make sure you do that, and we'll make sure we get that information to the
Thanks, everybody.
That was good.